The call forward. So you should have a message now saying it's recording.
So I feel like Robin sort of introduced herself and Vi introduced herself a little bit. Maybe if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Paul. I imagine you might remember I called in a few weeks ago, although I think it got a bit dark as we were talking, and so I think my camera went out. But yeah, Tara and I have the farm where Camden and Andrea are doing their school down here in Georgia, and we've been farming there for about 15 years. I don't know, do you want to say anything?
I guess related to education, like we've been working with all ages of people, but maybe more often teens and younger, like down. I've worked at Montessori schools with toddler to 12 years old, and then I've also worked with doing outdoor experiential education with youth ages 8 to 17, and then on the farm we've had interns, people who wanted to learn about growing food and primitive living and earthen building and things like that. And so we've had people of all ages come around who we've tried to offer space for learning.
And then I'm also a birth educator and a doula as well. So I hold space for people at times of transformation.
Do you go to their homes or do they come to you?
Both.
Yeah.
And then I support that. Like, I don't deliver babies, so I help them. I'm there for the birthing person, not for the baby. So, and the family, to help them know maneuver in the world of birth, especially helpful when it's their first time.
That's wonderful. I have a friend, a student here who's a doula too.
Yeah, and so I don't know if y'all have any other questions about us. I'm happy to, we can entertain questions about us at any point if you want them. But the topic or the question that we had in mind for the evening was how do we talk and teach really directly about holism? And so like distinguishing from like holistic education, a lot of times, the way that we've practiced it and seen it practiced and talked about, like we might teach things, we try to teach in context. So if we're going to teach about measuring and fractions, maybe we would do that on a construction project or in baking, so that there's context and a reason to learn. And maybe if we're, also, having a holistic, approach to education, we might, also talk about the fact that we're learning social interactions while we're baking or doing this construction project. And so just as kind of an acknowledgement of all of these things that are going on in the room when we're teaching. And I want to distinguish that from talking about holism and talking about interconnectedness, like really directly. Like I think we would probably all agree that the world is like a really interconnected place. Like interconnection is something that really like defines our world in a lot of ways. And I'm curious how we talk about that. And there's ways that I've talked about it and seen it talked about. I think in the last meeting that I was part of, there was some discussion about like the work of Fritjof Capra and David Bohm and, Thomas Berry and some of these people who kind of have this cosmology and physics around, systems theory and other kinds of ways to talk about interconnection in the world. And that's one way to talk about it. But we could talk like, one of the things that Tara and I were talking about prior to this is like, that's not a language that's really helpful to talk about interconnection to a 5-year-old. So if we want to talk about how interconnected the world is to a 5-year-old, then we would need a different language. We would need a different framework. We can acknowledge the interconnectedness of the world in the way we teach. But I'm interested in how we speak to it, like really directly and consciously and in that way. And so that's sort of the topic or the question that I'm bringing right now.
I actually had one of my student, Marisol, ask, or it was talking about how this is a holistic school. And one of the other students says, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And she didn't know.
Right.
and I realized too, like, how do I say this to them? And I think I probably talked about like holism in terms of like learning the whole subject of the thing and looking at, we try to understand our whole selves. We try to understand, if we're learning about something, we try and understand the whole story of that thing. But after saying it, like, I realized, like, I don't think she could go and repeat that. Mm-hmm. Or I don't know if that really like sunk in a way that was meaningful. So yeah,
it's kind of a tautology in a way where it's like it's whole because it's whole. Mm-hmm. Like, this is a holistic school because we talk about things being wholes, and it's hard to talk about. Like, how do you do it? It's
right. Right.
Yeah. At Runga they often talked about head, heart, and hands, but I think the teachers talked about it more than the students. And to me, what it was about was being in relationship to the students in the context wherever you were, whether it was in the classroom or outside the classroom. But I still learned more about it by observing Andrea and Fran than I learned anywhere else. Well, that's not true. There were several really incredible teachers there. But it's a different discourse than the discourse of adults. It's the relating in context to the kids. And I don't know that you have to tell them about it, because they are discovering it by being allowed to do all kinds of things, like cooking or going outside or doing things in a context that makes sense to them. And sometimes often it was a classroom context. But with lots of things to enliven their understanding of themselves in relation to their environment, and designing the whole school in a way that was about connecting them to other students and to their environment.
Yeah, and I am interested too in how we talk about it. Like, I gave a 5-year-old kid as an example of somebody who might not really resonate with the framework of systems theory or quantum physics and quantum entanglement, but there are plenty of adults that also don't really resonate with this way of talking about things. And so I think that, not just talking about children.
I'm wondering if you could create an experience rather than telling them. I mean, like the experience of, like, it's a sunny day and they go out and lie on the grass, and then they feel the sun. And then you could, maybe you have some plants lying around, someone planted somewhere. And then ask them questions like, how do the plants live? They're green. Where do they get? I don't know. I'm just thinking, about creating an experience where they can tell you what they're feeling about what they're experiencing. I mean, does that make sense? And then you can talk about how the plants make food because the sun, and then we eat the food, and where's the food go? Goes into our tummy. Then it becomes part of us, and and there's a lot of little things in our body that helps the food get digested. I don't know how far you could go. I haven't had a 5-year-old around for a long, long time, so I don't remember.
Well, what I hear you saying, at least how I'm interpreting that, is it's just setting a stage. No matter how old somebody is, if we're setting a stage for them to discover the holism themselves through key inquiry.
Yeah.
It reminds me of an activity I used to love doing at summer camp. I would teach gardening often.
It reminded me of that activity too.
Yeah, and so before my gardening class, though, my opening activity, I would very often go and I would raid the kitchen for all kinds of different foods. Cans of mushrooms, home canned green beans, a carrot, just anything. Coffee, like wide variety of food. And I would go and I put it all in a bag and I'd dump it all out on the ground. And then we would do it like it was sort of an investigation of like, what can we know about this food? Well, like this has a label on it. It says, packaged in Indonesia, or, this has, what do we just already know about coffee, what is likely have been grown? What can you tell me about the lives of the people who grew it? What was that probably like? And just going through sort of like the story of stuff. For me, it was in the context of food because I do a lot of things in the context of food, but you could do it with anything. And I think that had that effect. Like it had the, that inquiry that Vi's kind of talking about did, I feel like, generate this sense of like, wow, these things all have stories. And I remember even getting like some outrage because we did this really long convoluted story about a bag of coffee, and just really went through like every single thing that we could think of about the coffee being grown and roasted and ground and packaged and put on a ship and put on a boat and put on a truck. And then I told them I had dumpster dived it because I had. And they were actually kind of outraged, that like all this story of that coffee ended up in the dumpster. And so that was a good thing that worked. It worked enough that I did it frequently.
Yeah, that's the key. I think that you don't do it all at once. Of course, you have days and weeks to expand on stuff, and then they could eventually see that there's the relationship between the sun and the plants and us and the rest of the air, the air that plants breathe, and they also, exhale, like the idea of photosynthesis without having to use the big words. I don't know, it would be an interesting to me to see that process happen with the children as the days went by, and that exposure, being outside. Of course, you have to take them outside, so it'd be a nice summer, spring would be a great time to go through that. I don't know, have like a unit on that, and see what they come up with at the end after 3 weeks. What did you feel? What did you learn? And then maybe they could do some drawings, and they could do some artwork. I don't know, just you can imagine all kinds of things, but they have more imagination than we do, so they could come up with a lot of creative ideas, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then the older, are they mixed? Are the kids like different ages in that same group, or are they?
Well, I think that in the particular school here, we have we have different ages, and then also thinking about kind of I work with adults who are going to be giving birth, and as well as youth, and or teenagers even sometimes in other settings, and how different tools that we can use to talk about this in different settings. I think that the exploration is around a variety of settings. Like that seems like actually
there are different ways that that activity that you're talking about, Vi, and like that you, this way of presenting it that you have brought up, that can be used in all different ages.
Yeah, I mean, even when after the baby's born and the mama's milk, well, where does the milk come from? And you know, I don't know, you just weave all these different relationships into the activity, and then they can come up with figuring it out on their own, what that interconnectedness is about. I mean, everything is the organism. I mean, it's like everything is an organism, a super organism, and we're part of it, but we're not separated from. So I don't know, it can get deep, but you can bring it back to them, so that to their level, whatever it is, with whatever tools they have to discover, and then also to express, and probably through art, maybe dancing, I don't know, you could see little flowers dancing and basking in the sunlight and just being happy. And oh God, children, it's just such a joy to go back and working with them. I would love to go back and work with these little kids, but I can't anymore. All I can do is sit here and come up with ideas. Anyway.
Well, Runa in the grade 6, that I observed for a whole term, the same term I was observing Andrea and Fern in kindergarten, they had something called Baranagon, which is integrated, and they were studying water systems. And the teacher never gave the answer to, and there were 2 teachers. They worked together, a science teacher and a social studies teacher. They started from where they are, and the inquiry was, how does the water get to you? And the initial round then was just thinking about how it gets from the local water treatment plant to their house. And that inquiry lasted about 3 weeks, until eventually they were ready to go visit the water treatment plant and learn more about it. But the process of learning was just so gradual, and they would always wait for the students to come up with the questions, and it wouldn't be 1 or 2 students, or 25 in a classroom. And they were very careful in how they facilitated it to make sure that every inquiry process involved every student having a say in explaining and inquiring and asking questions, and then creating posters. And every step of the process, they created mind maps and all kinds of things, working in small groups where they kept looking what is the source of the water, until by the end of the term, the students had to plan a field trip 3 hours away to the spring water where it came from. But it was just this step-by-step inquiry, that the students always felt like it was student-led, but as I observed, and I did lots of interviews with the teachers, it wasn't really student-led. It was really led by the teachers who knew where they were going with it. But they always facilitated in a way that the students were completely involved in the process. And sometimes they did other inquiries on the side that related to it, like how water comes out of the leaves and things. I forget what that's called scientifically, but where they would study the leaves and how it comes out of the leaves. And so they were really looking in depth at the different sources of water, but it was done in a way so they always felt connected to the next step, that all of the students felt connected to the next step. They wouldn't go on until the whole group was together in looking at this inquiry. Where's the source of the water, until eventually they found they physically walked to, they visited the great big dam, I forget the name of it, that is one of the major sources for where the water comes from, and then the little town above the dam, and interviewed the people who were part of that process before the dam was built, and how their villages were affected negatively by the dam. And they would have these, it was trying to look at the whole issue of the water and its source in all different ways. And then at the very end, they did some of the stuff Vi was talking about, of using dance and drama and performance and creating news programs, but taking what they've learned to share with the parents and the wider community about this very complex process that they've just learned of, and all the people are so important. Interviewing people at the water treatment plant, the people who make the little canals that go between the dam, which is the water treatment plants in Bangkok. The dam is like 3 hours up from it. And then the people who are affected in the little towns when the dam was built, which it was about like in the 1980s or something. So it was a while back, but they had elders who walked them all the way up above the dam to see where that actual spring water came out of. And because they took the whole term to go such depth, when they did those final projects, they were all they all understood the connections from one thing to another. And the teachers are kind of trained to help students ask the right questions to look at all those connections so that it's not studying something that's disconnected from who they are, but it starts from who they are and goes outward. It was fascinating. And it took many years for them to develop that group too. It didn't just happen.
That's a pretty thorough example of a way to bring holism in the classroom.
Yeah. Andrea, what about you? I mean, you experienced so much in that kindergarten river room.
Yeah, I loved it. Yeah, I'm thinking a lot, Robin. This conversation is so cool because it's very like pertinent to what we're trying to do right now. Is like understand what is this school, like what is holism, and what do we mean when we say that it's this thing. And I realize that I'm still figuring that out constantly, and how so often it's my like personal lived experiences that help me understand what I mean when I say a holistic learning environment. And like being with Paul and Terra and on the land and trying to develop the school in the last like few months, I've done things I've never done before, even as simple as gardening and identifying trees and building a fence and putting in a fan and like having the hands-on experience of doing these things and then realizing what it takes to make that happen. And I mean, Paul and Terra are humble. I'm not going to go into all the detail of the amazing things they've done, but I will a little bit. They've built their house from cob and just poured an enormous amount of energy into curating the space where they live with a tremendous amount of energy and respect for the land. But, you know, you can see that, and that's one thing, and you can hear about it or you can read about it, but to do it yourself and to be hands-on. And so when we're asking students or anyone to try and understand what this means, until like we have the experience of doing it ourselves, we don't understand where something comes from. And so I try to keep that in my mind and my heart as I'm creating, you know, what we're learning with the students. So, you know, right now we're making bread and we're doing that every week. And even though it seems really repetitive, but the students get to see all the ingredients that go into making bread. They get to feel what the dough is like. They get to see it rise and then eat it like fresh. And then, you know, you could take that back even further. Like, where does the flour come from? But, you know, okay, one step at a time. And I think when we as adults or when the students have this meaning, this connection to what it is that they're doing, it naturally has that understanding of that interconnectedness, and that holism comes with that story. So when they plant the seed themselves and see it grow, and then they have some food as a result of that, they're more likely to taste that food because they grew it themselves, rather than and this is actually funny, this actually happened is last week or this week, I can't remember, Paul invited one of our students into the garden to pull carrots up, and I had carrots for snack, but I had cut them and they were from the store. And so there was like several carrots, and they still, you know, they were fresh out of the ground. And the student, after helping to harvest some of them, and they're just small little carrots, brings them to our snack, and I've got this big bowl of nice cut up carrots, but no one wanted to eat them. They did eventually once the other ones were gone, but they all wanted the carrot that came right out of the ground, and they all ate that first, and even one student only would eat those. And like, it was just this perfect example of when you get your hands into something where you see where it comes from, the meaning of it. I mean, there's no comparison. There's no comparison. So that was pretty cool. So just, trying to help students have those experiences where they get to feel that interconnectedness firsthand.
But I have a question though, because I grew up with a huge garden, and when I visited my grandparents, they had big gardens, and I helped pick all the raspberries, and I helped plant the carrots and the potatoes and pick the tomatoes, and we did all that in my family when I was growing up. It was, now that I look back, it was wonderful, but we never talked about it. We just did it. We talked about how to snap the peas and how to best wash the raspberries and how to prepare them for the meal. But the value and the interconnectedness of it wasn't part of the conversation, or even, it was just what we did because my parents had grown up in farming communities, and it saved money, but they just loved gardening. But I never felt the kind of depth and connection when I listened to you talk about it, Andrea. It was almost, I don't know, I'm just thinking, when you're doing a school, it's more than just doing it. There is a reflective component to it also.
And that's kind of what I'm trying to tease out, is that, we could, I mean, there's even, there's 4-H clubs at the local high school where kids raise cows and goats and probably milk them and breed them. And it tends to be kind of livestock heavy. I don't think there's a whole lot of people. 4-H tends to be a lot of livestock, but I'm sure there's vegetable growers that come out of 4-H too, and it doesn't really matter. But I wouldn't say that it's holistic.
Right.
I wouldn't say that it's maybe like less fragmented than like, the school cafeteria. Everything's in shades of gray, but I wouldn't call 4-H a holistic program,
But that's a great example. My mom was in 4-H. She brought up beef cattle, and she did all that. And I love my mom, but I don't feel like she brought me up in a holistic way, even though there were really healthy elements to it. But there was fragmentation too, and but in schools that are holistic, you're doing something more than 4-H. And what is it?
I think that, please.
There's a feeling space. You're not just doing it because you were brought up to do it, which is pretty much why my parents did it, because that's what they learned to love it, but they never learned to talk about that feeling and the interconnectedness. So when we didn't have gardens anymore, they just started buying stuff and didn't even pay that much attention to organic or not organic. So what is it that you talk about, and how do you talk about it in a way that connects the kids to what they're doing in a deeper way?
Mm. Well, the whole idea of holism, holons, which is like embedded, like you have, like the Russian dolls, right? You've got one inside the other, and inside the other, and inside the other, and inside the other. And so that you have a whole. So maybe exploring the idea of wholeness or completeness. I mean, this comes from David Bohm. I think you mentioned David Bohm. That whole idea of wholeness, where the sum of the fragments, and you're talking about fragments, they're not 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, but they're greater than the sum of the numbers that are added. And so how do you get, where does that, I mean, how do you get it to be greater than the sum of those numbers? And that's because that integration of the fragments in the parts and the parts in the whole. So it's all about going back to the whole. I don't know. I don't even know how to explain it either. So, but how could you show them that idea of everything being a part of every other system? I mean, there's a little system. I mean, you start out like there was the atoms, and then you had the molecules, and then you had the bigger or compounds, and then and eventually you had life, and then it's like one system inside another system inside another system. I mean, how could you show that idea so that they come to realize that, oh, we're a part of everything else, and there's kind of like magic in it, because we're I don't know. It's how would you do that if you're trying to teach them about holism or the idea of wholeness, right? And parts, and I don't know, just asking. I mean, does that make sense? If you wanted to teach them about what do we mean by holism, or without having to say, because holism starts with an H, but it's also holism with a whole W. So it could be confusing. I wish I had some Russian dolls.
I'd like to hear more, because you've worked with kids on your farm before even the school came. And so how are the two of you with your farm? What has been your way of kind of being in that particular context and helping young people of different ages come to kind of be more reflective about how things are interconnected and how they're connected to what they're doing?
Well, I can give an example of so teaching weaving and spinning and like fiber arts with youth. One way that I've done is to start with teaching them how to make cordage out of, like, let's go and get the bark from the inner bark from the poplar tree, and then we'll look at that and we'll shred that apart, and then we can twist that together. So actually my hair is corded. So if you twist the two strands in one direction and then you cross them in the other direction, to teaching the kids how to make this. And so with that basic skill, then talking about how this is a skill that all of our ancestors have been able to do. This is very ancient, and this is how ropes are made. This is how thread. Let's look at our clothes. Look at, oh, do you see the shape of your clothes have lines that go this way and this way? And you see all those little threads, and then let's look at this person's clothes and see, oh, do they have threads that we can see? Well, all those threads are twisted in that similar way and then woven together. And so like discovering and looking at each other's things and looking at the world around us, and then imagining different ways that rope can be used, and then getting our hands on it and making this cordage, this rope, in the physical world also, like learning the skill and starting to discover and asking questions and looking at each other's things has been a way that I have approached that with kids. And so they get some of that discovery, and they get that connecting the dots of things, and also starting to notice, maybe even starting to notice fabrics when they're in their everyday life. Ooh, look, I see that looks woven, or that looks knit. For an example.
Yeah, weaving's a great metaphor that can kind of help spark that sort of moment of reflection that Robin was talking about, of like, what we're doing is more than just, growing food or weaving something, we're doing that and then also having a moment of reflection on that so that we can sort of sit with some of the deeper implications of whatever it is that we've just done and see how that goes on. One of the ways that I've talked about it a lot, again, in the context of growing food, because that's what I teach about most, is through animism. So like most farmers that I know, almost all of the farmers that I know really, like if, let's say I have a crop failure, and maybe I would be asking like, I wonder if they didn't have enough phosphorus, or, I wonder if, it wasn't enough water, or maybe there was a particular virus or a bacteria that caused this disease. And so this is to me, like not a holistic approach to farming, because you're really trying to reduce the cause of a failure to a particular agent, a particular cause. It's a kind of a very, reductionist take on the failure of your crop. So for me, I've kind of learned that it's actually really helpful, both just in terms of enjoying myself and also in getting good crops. I mean, we grow about 80% of our food. And so we take it pretty seriously. Getting a good crop is not really, it's non-negotiable. We have to do that. And so my approach as I'm doing it and as I'm teaching it and talking about it, if I have a crop that, like maybe I planted a bunch of cabbage and they didn't make cabbage, I might just say, it seems like the cabbage just didn't want to grow there. Like there's really more agency on the cabbage, if anything. And I think that this is kind of a heuristic. It's like a little bit of a shortcut, like a rule of thumb of like an acknowledgement of how interconnected everything is. And that I'm not actually meaningfully going to be able to attribute this failure to a lack of phosphorus or a pathogen. It's more like, well, if you took into account the fungal network and the phosphorus and the way that the shortage of phosphorus maybe made it more prone to the pathogen, and then also that it's just too much, like there's too many variables, and you really can't do it in a meaningful way for me. And so if you acknowledge that it's all just too interconnected and it's all just too big and you really can't wrap your mind around it, it really just makes as much sense to say, well, the cabbage just didn't really want to grow there.
And the cabbage is a living being who has agency in some way, so they can push through and try, or they can fail because they feel weak. They're right. For whatever reason.
Yeah, just like maybe they didn't get the right kind of music. Like I didn't sing to them enough when I went down the row or something, because if we really acknowledge how interconnected everything really is, it actually is meaningful to attribute that agency to the cabbage itself, because it's a whole with all of these different parts, but it just gets so fuzzy when you start taking it all apart like that. You can't really do it, not in a living system.
And then that helps the students to even problem solve in a different way, just to think more long term. Where are we going to plant the cabbage next year, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's a whole nother mode of inquiry, like, well, why didn't the cabbage want to grow here? Opens up a lot of, I think maybe Robin said something about a felt sense, like there's a lot more of an ability to just sort of intuitively, read the situation and be able to come to some kind of an understanding. And it's a different mode of inquiry that I think actually more explicitly acknowledges how vastly interconnected everything is.
Feels like what I've heard, what Paul, you were just talking about, is when we see a situation or a problem, how do we, as the teacher in this case, present that in a way that creates a certain sentiment toward the earth, toward the food, and then following that presentation, there's a similar sentiment that goes into the questioning. So you can present a situation, you can ask questions, but what's the feeling? What's the attitude or the value that's there and behind the way that you're presenting, and then following that with a particular line of questioning. So do you present it in a way of, oh, the cabbage, the cabbage died, this stinks, or I don't know, not in a really positive way that then doesn't help them lead to positive questioning. Or when, looking at, okay, well, what other fabric can we see? How is it woven? And helping us to like see it in a way that takes our vision and expands it to how this simple way of making cordage is everywhere around us. So I think like what I'm noticing is I have to be really aware of, one, the way that I frame and I present a certain situation. There's a certain feeling and sentiment behind that. And then following that, the types of questions really matter. It's not just asking questions, but what kind of questions are you asking? And I'm not exactly sure the language to use of what that quality is. It seems like there's this underlying value of interconnectedness, but sometimes that's hard to wrap your mind around. Like, how do you do that in a positive direction?
Andrew, that was so helpful. I listened to Tara and now I'm going to forget your name.
Tara and Paul.
Tara and Paul. And then when you summarized it, I saw it helped. You just reframed what they said in a way that was helpful to me.
Good. Help me understand it myself.
To look at that inquiry of what are we doing that makes it holistic instead of just talking about things in more fragmented ways.
And I think another thought that I've had as Paul and Tara speak is what I've noticed with them is they have this deep understanding of like the garden and maybe why the cabbage wouldn't grow that I don't have, or why certain things are happening in the world. And so I think like I'm noticing like I have to develop some of that to some extent, and so that I can start to ask the right questions. Like if I don't know that thread is cordage, then how can I help students become aware of that? And so that's like as a teacher, a self-development. If I want to work with students in that way, I have to know it. And that's like, oh damn, now I actually have to keep learning stuff.
Oh yay!
Yay! That's right, Tara. That's what I meant.
I found it interesting that you used the weaving and the cordage metaphor, not even metaphor, direct example. Because this week in one of my classes, one of my students brought in a spinning wheel and used it as an example for a learning strategy for just knowing, wondering, learning how to make charts with students while teaching them at the same time. So it's just funny how things connect, and that just happened this week. And then you made interconnections, and your example of animism too. I had a friend who reframed something for me this week using animism with an object, and all of a sudden it made me completely look at it in a different way. I said I had lost my keys, and I let him know I found them. He replied, "Oh, I'm so glad your keys found you." And I just thought, yeah, they did, didn't they? And there was a reframing just with that simple little flipping of things, where it's not about me, it's about me. It's not about
it's about relationship.
Yeah, even with objects, not only just things that you grow, but even with objects.
Sitting here, I was having a little bit of insight, idea, like around when we are approaching through an animist perspective of the world and recognizing the aliveness the beings around us who we tend to, like, that we can't hear in the same way that like the plants particularly. And I was thinking of about the kids going on the nature walk and playing in the woods, and I was having just this moment of the framing of let's go visit our forest friends as like a recognition of the forest being alive, and we're gonna go and spend time with these beings in their home.
Yeah, it was because of, I think it was 2 weeks ago, or when Paula joined us and from the Secret Garden, and she shared about her school out in Oregon, and she mentioned how they always name the trees. It's not just that tree over there, it's the cedar or the oak, and I brought that up with Tara, and I said that I think this is really important. I don't know the names of any trees that are around. Can you help with this? And she did, and that's been the project that we've been working on for the past few weeks. Is I've been learning alongside with the students about the different trees that are on the land. And this week it was cool because I asked the students, what trees do you want to take a picture with? What trees do you love? And they all could name a tree that they like felt a connection with. They may not have known exactly where it was. Some students did. They knew exactly what tree they wanted to find and knew where it was. And that simple recognition of this is my friend, I know this being, and I feel a connection to this living tree, was just so inspiring. And like I now go for walks and I look at all the leaves on the ground, I'm like, red oak, white oak, poplar. And it's a completely different experience of being in the world. And so it's kind of cool having this experience simultaneously with the students, because I'm getting to feel what it's like to now have these forest friends and see the world in a different way. And I want more of that. So forest friends.
I've been noticing the dogwood behind my house. I sit out, it's raining this last couple of days, but for weeks at a time, I've been just going outside and watching how the poplar the dogwood, how it changes over time and how its leaves move differently when there's subtle differences in the wind and how it makes different noises. And I've started to feel this relationship that I don't have to say anything. I can just sit there and that tree is communicating with me. But it's all just observation and just being present, sitting next to a beautiful dogwood that has changed dramatically since the spring. It's gone through so many different phases. And then how the squirrels and different birds relate to the tree. And I start to notice it just by observing that same tree over and over, because it's right at my back porch. And it's so, yeah, it feels right to develop relationships with the especially the nature things around us. But we do it with objects too. Yeah. Animism. This is really good. I hadn't put words around it before.
Yeah, I think it's nice. It's kind of relatable, and it's like if we take the Russian doll example, it's like if we take the Russian doll all apart, then we kind of need a framework for like how do we get that Russian doll all back together so that we can see the whole thing. But I think sometimes when you're dealing with 5-year-olds, like they haven't really taken the doll apart yet, and so we don't necessarily need, and it wouldn't even be useful to like. It's like sometimes I think that we can. Personally, I come from a very reductionist scientific kind of background. Like I have an engineering background, that's my education. And so like I think that I had to go through this process of taking all of those dolls out and then realizing that they all had to go back together again, you know. And I think there's a lot of people that works really well for, you know. But I think that when we're talking to a young child that hasn't taken that doll apart yet, we can actually maybe just save them the trouble, you know. And I think that animism is a language. I think there's other things, fables, you know, some of the sort of, you know, inquiry type activities that we were talking about earlier in the conversation. There's lots of different, I think, ways to do that. Probably more that we could touch on if we had some creativity.
And at the base of that animism, there's compassion. There's this like recognition of spirit, or yeah, it's really interesting thing.
I want to say hello to Young-hee. Is that how you say your name? And welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm very sorry to join late. I read your website and saw lots of pictures, and I really wanted to hear from you. So yeah, I'm glad that I got the second half, a little tail end. But it's just fascinating to me. Where Robin and I live in the Ashland Lithia Park, we kind of almost coexist with a lot of the animals around, and especially the deer. So I just encountered this deer, and there were a lot of people in the small alleyway, and they were just trying to take a picture of the deer with the little horns coming out, and it's just kind of young adolescent. And then, so I think I would say he would want to avoid the crowd and coming out of that to this way, and then we were coming toward him. So then he really got lost in the middle. It's like a very perplexed look of where I go, and then found a little kind of little space between the alleys, and I felt. And speaking of animism and also the perspective taking, what would I do if I were the deer? So, I mean, we're taking over their territory and the boundaries, and we look them as kind of, little strange animals, but then they look us. It's like a, keep invading the spaces. So yeah, I felt that, I don't know, so last 30 years that ecologists sharing the data that there are about 70% of wild animals have died, and we're down to really about 30% what's left here. And so we're really definitely invading their territory, and also the environmental changes and the weather changes and just the habitat changes, and it's just so much of damage that we're doing from our own perspective. So yeah, that reminded me of that. I don't know where I was going with it, but it's just like from deer's point of view, the world has changed a lot. And they are trying to go between the human footsteps and really so
well, it gives me some good ideas, Young-hee, for those the beginning conversations in classrooms where I do mindfulness activities, to do some more activities for taking the perspective of the wildlife around us, and there is so much.
Mhm.
And bringing that into classroom discussions, because all of us live here in this environment where it's unique, really, in all the places I've lived, to have every day 4 or 5 deer go by my car and into the front yard, and they're just around us all the time. And I feel like I'm constantly thinking in relation to them and being more quiet and gentle and things, but I don't talk to students about it that much. And yet the students are having these experiences too, and how important that is. Yeah.
I don't know if you have talked about birth, the stories of Terra. I was just reading of your the article, and it was so fascinating to me how you captured the mysterious and amazing the process of birthing. Yeah, did you have a chance? That I know it's almost time, but yeah.
I haven't talked much about my birth experience. But I am also a birth worker and support other people. So I just really only mentioned that a little bit. I didn't go very deep into that. No. Is there in is there anything in particular that you're called, Youngie, to ask about or
Well, I think your story caught my attention when Paul said that when you were thinking about having a baby, you really had a lot of talks, and really the respect and trust, and really thinking about what could be, what would that be like for you too. And I don't think that's common.
You're right. As a birth worker, especially, I like, and then also with my own experience, I have friends who have been pregnant and people I've worked with directly that the person who's giving birth would, a lot of them would feel like, oh, I really feel like I could give birth at home, or I really would like to, but my partner doesn't feel comfortable with that. And so we're going into this setting because they are not ready for that, but I feel like I could be ready for that. And that happens a lot. And so, yeah, I think we really do have a unique relationship in that Paul really trusts me to know my body, and when I'm working with people in birth, like they're the expert on themselves first and foremost. We are all the expert on our own bodies, and then the person closest to us is in the birth room. The partner is the next expert on our wishes, and so and the staff then is the people we're there to support these people in this person in birthing, not to necessarily tell them what to do and have them feel like they don't know what they're doing, because they do. Their bodies know in there, and we just help them, support them in drawing that out and finding that way, and offering our understanding from our back experience to help them be able to interpret the sensations that they're having, if they're feeling confused or scared or uncomfortable.
I think a lot of times that we are not trained to trust our own intuition, even if it's our own body, that we just kind of follow what's been common, and follow the common practice, go to the hospital and go to the you know, get their opinions, because they are sort of experts in this, right? Even above and beyond of my own knowing and my knowledge. So myself, you know, just to kind of, because there's so much fear, so much worries that what if? So then I think, or I myself, I lost my own, you know, confidence. I mean, I was so fearful when I was close to give birth to my first one, because I was relating to all those stories, like, you know, what if I die in the middle of process? What if, you know, the baby, am I gonna come back home? And all those things. I think I let it take over of my, maybe my confidence or my trust, so that it just happened in the, probably maybe the best way that I could see, but probably not the real best way for myself and for my daughter, which I was not aware of. So yeah, I I just it was incredible to read of your story, because there are some people who think differently, you know, and we don't have to go by the common custom, right? If I believe in different ways, I could make the decision for myself. I don't think I was strong enough to say that. So yeah.
This is connecting with me to so in my birth work, I talk with people
about the different ways of knowing. That there's the modern medical way of knowing, there's the ancient way of knowing, like ancestral way of knowing, and then there's the inner knowing. And so all of these have validity, like they're all these different ways of knowing are how we gather information, like the nuts and the berries that we put in our gathering basket. And then when it's time to use that knowledge, like when it's time to birth, we're not going to eat the sticks that might have fallen into our basket. We're going to pick through and take in what is going to like really nourish us and be our specific medicine that we need in order to do the task or the work that is ahead that we are in. And so and then also that birth is like, there's not one way to do this. There's like so many different ways to have a baby, so many different things. And that goes into also there's like, I might say that there's a way to weave, but there's in some ways also so many different ways to weave. Like we're talking about all the different kinds of fabric and the way that threads are put together. And it just, even in knitting, there's so many different patterns and number of stitches you can do. But then there's also the basic, like the baby grows inside and comes out, and then you have a baby, whether it's a cesarean birth or a vaginal birth. That's the process. And it happens, and there's all the details are specific to the individual, but the overall experience is you can map the territory by just like, it's just the territory. Like these are, you can study the territory, but you're not gonna know what your itinerary is gonna be. And so that, like, being kind of a holistic approach to birth in a way of just like holding that space of there's a lot of different ways to do this, and we can gather information, yet we still have to hold that space of the unknown.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And that is when, it's like when working with kids too, you're holding the space of the unknown while still like having a map of the container or the territory that you'll work with them within.
Yeah, it's like working with teachers too. There's
Yeah.
You have a framework and you know kind of where you might go, but then they'll ask different questions and take you in different directions. And so adapting to who they are in the moment, it's so important. And so everything you've just described about how you're supporting the birthing process is also feels like a description of working in the territory of more holistic education approaches too. I mean,
and I would extend that to say that that's more or less also how I farm. You know, like there's sort of a terrain and a topography of, you know, things that are likely to happen in a field in a given year. I may or may not be able to influence some of them to a greater degree or not. You know, and in the end, there's food. You know, like it's a fairly similar kind of philosophy. It's pretty broadly applicable.
And also because of the living being of the earth and the soil, that each year they change, right? So you just have to also expect that there's unknowns that let it happen. I mean, we can do as much as we can nurture our water and kind of pull the weeds out and things like that, but also trust the earth, trust the sun and everything, the nature, to really do the work. And still it might come out differently too.
Yeah, that's what Tara was saying about that living with uncertainty, that the teaching is all of that, and living with uncertainty is just so much part of stepping into any relationship with people who are dynamic and changing, and the land and the farm that is dynamic and changing.
It'll be so great to continue to maybe next time, second series of this, to hear more stories, more wisdom.
Yeah, we'll have to have Paul and Tara back for sure.
Yeah,
They've got a lot more to share. And I don't have any speakers lined up for the upcoming session, so it could be sooner than later. Yeah, I have some intention to reach out to some others, but we'll see who the upcoming sessions are. But if you all be interested in coming back, we'd love to.
Yeah. So much to unpack. Thank you so much for sharing the website and your stories and pictures. It's just so beautiful.
Well, thank you for looking at it.
I wonder where that hit came from.
Somebody's looking. But that's your generosity, I think, that you put it out there. You don't know who's looking, but you are, just because of your such I think your what can I say, like a good-heartedness. I just felt it. I just felt that wow. I wanted to just come to your session because I know they would be so amazing. So thank you for letting me be part of that.
Well, I'm glad to get to be here, and I'm glad to meet you all virtually.
Younghee, Vi, Robin, you can come visit Carrollton, Georgia anytime.
Yeah.
Love to have you.
I would love to come when I can. I'm not sure when that will be, but at some point.
We'll be here.
Very far away.
It's a long couple of plane rides probably to get there.
And it's the same country at least.
It's the same country. It's less far than where I've been in distance from other people. So
Right.
I will get there eventually.
Well, thank you all so much for joining. Thanks, Paul and Tara, for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you all in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Right.
Have a good evening.
You
Have a
too.
good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.